Hi, it's Terry McDougall with another episode of Winning the Game of Work. And I am joined today by my partner on this series, Lisa Edmondson, who is the founder of Leadership Reno. She's dedicated to helping eradicate toxic workplaces and workplace bullying. And joining us again today are John Augusto, who is Associate Dean at Georgia State University and also a consultant and an expert on the Clifton Strengths Finders, and Alexander Andrews, who is a longtime business consultant, former business executive, and author of Unlike a Boss. Gallup has estimated that it costs businesses worldwide $8.1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, due to attrition, turnover, and lack of employee engagement and productivity. So anything that we can do to create a more healthy work environment, to get the right leaders in place to unlock the full potential of employees, it's going to benefit companies, it will benefit employees, and quite frankly, make the world a better place. So join us as we dive into where we left off last time. Welcome to Winning the Game of Work, a podcast that helps you enjoy the happy and successful career you've dreamed of. Because let's face it, being hardworking and smart just aren't enough in today's competitive workplace. I'm your host, Terry McDougall, an experienced executive coach who will teach you all the right moves so you can win the game of work with ease and confidence. I've had some narcissistic, really toxic leaders, and actually the ones that I have in mind actually were women. So it's not just men that can be bad leaders, but a lot of times people who are narcissistic are great actors, and they really can control people's perspective or view of them and how they show up. And so they can manage up well, and they appear to be great leaders when they're actually being very abusive to people under them. Alex and John, I would love for you to jump in and add perspective here, because I know both of you have a lot of experience, both personally, but also in your coaching and consulting businesses.
Yeah, so the example I gave earlier around my role before I wrote the book was probably the most severe narcissist I had ever come across. And like you said, he actually masked those behaviors very well from me for about a year. Now, in the lead up to me moving into that role, I was acting chief operating officer for the role after I'd been there for a while, doing consulting. The people turnover in that business was 300% in the previous 2 years. I ran an employee net promoter score survey, and in the first week I was consulting, and that was -7%, which is the worst I'd ever seen. So obviously more detractors than there were promoters. And he threw the previous general manager of the business under the bus and blamed it all on her, that she was a bully. And anyway, I set about an improvement path, and within 12 months, it had turned around to be plus 60% net promoter score, virtually nil people turnover. And it was a success story in terms of the revenue increase, profit increase. It was all dandy, but I think Lisa mentioned this before as well. He liked being the center of attention, and he hated the fact that everyone was loving working with me, because the whole business reported through to me, and started to do a series of things behind my back and undermining me and trying to get people to turn against me, which I just found it bizarre that someone would want to do that when I've just turned their business around. But it was just deep-seated narcissism, and he needed to be the one that was the center of attention. So that's just one example. But I've got countless.
This is so puzzling to me, because I've seen it so often where, Lisa, in your situation, where there's high performing teams with people that are engaged, and then a new manager comes in, and then the business basically starts rotting out from the center because there's abuse and people start leaving, or they become discouraged and they're not performing at the high levels. And then the new manager can sort of spin it to say, oh, well, Lisa's not doing a good job, or we've got to change this or that. What is it that causes upper management to be open to this idea that all of a sudden something that was working very well is all of a sudden broken? And why is it that certain leaders are able to mask the reason when it's actually their leadership style that's causing the issues? Because I think that that's at the heart of how we solve this. How is this possible?
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I think that's part of the leader going out and walking the space and talking with people. I used to work at a university, and the chancellor was known to do that. literally just walk the halls of the main administrative building, stick her head in, ask how things are going. Now, as a manager, knowing that my leader, right? So I'm leading a group and she's leading the university. That made an impression on me. Like, oh, she's paying attention. She wants to see things for herself. She'd ask people questions. Where do you work for? Do you like working for them? Just really good questions. And I think that's where leaders, especially at the upper management level, have to get out of the office, have to get into the spaces physically or virtually, have to continue to ask questions and ask questions. Lisa mentioned Gallup, the whole thing around employee engagement. They've got an employee engagement survey, and good companies do that systematically. So it's done, and there's so much light that that darkness that we talked about earlier has no place to go.
Yeah, management by walking around. Love that.
Yeah. So I guess an example I'll share, which I also share in more detail in the book to John's very point there, and that is about management by walking around and seeking the opinions actively of the team. So there was this scenario where my division was high performing and had really high people engagement score as per Gallup. It was in the 85th percentile across about 1,000 people. And there was a problematic division that had not met service levels for 7 years, believe it or not. People engagement score below the 50th percentile, and had lost 3 general managers because they just couldn't turn it around. And I was asked to turn it around. And at the same time, take $9 million of cost out of the business. And the first thing I did was actually walk the floors, because it was just basically what I did, is how I roll, basically, which is because I'm quite an intuitive person. And I like to get that sense, the vibe around the place and be seen. And so first thing I did was just sit down, pull up someone's desk, and I say, if you were me, what would you do? What would you do to fix this? What's broken? And within the next 6 to 9 months, the service levels were achieved for the first time in 7 years. The turnaround in the engagement score, they soared like eagles and got to the 80th percentile in 9 months. And we actually saved $11 million out of the business without retrenching anyone. So it was one of those good news stories around what John's point was exactly, which is get off your backside, go and walk around the business and listen to the people.
I found that if you listen to the complainers, the answers to your problems exist within the organization. But to Lisa's point earlier about being transparent and showing vulnerability and not feeling like you have to have all of the answers, it's really about relying on the people within the organization. I mean, Alex, you recognize that, hey, if I open up this problem and ask for input from the people who are living it and working it every day, maybe we can figure this out. It doesn't seem like rocket science, honestly.
No. And that's the thing. It's almost like, again, in my formative years, I almost was embarrassed to speak up because I was thinking what I want to talk about is so simple, yet people aren't getting it. And I found that quite frustrating. And there were people who were senior from me in terms of their role, but also in age. I used to get bullied in this particular organization when I first got promoted to general manager because I don't know if you remember the show for the American, I think it was a comedy called Doogie Howser, MD.
Oh, yeah, sure.
My nickname in this organization was Doogie Howser because I was 30 years old, general manager and running this large division, and all the other general managers were 50. So I'd always be called junior. And my opinion didn't count because I was junior. And so, but I had all these ideas in my head, and I'm thinking, no, this is so simple, they're not getting it. And I just went away about my business, executing those simple ideas and create these highly engaged teams.
Yeah. And for people who are listening to the podcast who aren't familiar with Doogie Howser, it's a TV show, and it was Neil Patrick Harris who played Doogie Howser, and he was a teenage doctor. So he was a genius, just to give people context who maybe aren't familiar with that. Yes. So another thing that has come to mind as we've been talking about this over the last few minutes is this whole idea of psychological safety. Because if there is management by walking around, so if your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss is walking around and stopping in to say, hey, how's it going? There needs to be this feeling that you can trust that person. And often things that are shared with maybe HR, we talked about this on the last episode, that HR isn't necessarily your friend. And Lisa and I both have experiences with sharing information with HR that it didn't make it better. But sometimes what can happen is that if an employee is transparent or frank about their point of view, that gets shared with their manager, and then that just gives the manager fodder for further bullying. So What role does this whole idea of psychological safety play in having an effective and healthy workplace?
I think to Alex's point, it just seems so simple. It seems so logical. Like, just be nice, be kind, don't be mean to people, make them feel safe, but let them trust you. Huge, huge component to their engagement. And the other thing that I wanted to touch back on is the part about management by walking around. Obviously, in these larger organizations, that's not something that's practical, and especially in times of COVID. But the engagement surveys that we've been talking about, such as the one that Dr. John mentioned, Gallup provides, that tells you there are literal numbers in those surveys and those results that tell you where there's problems. And so that was another component to my solution is one, do employees engagement surveys, and two, act on the results. So when you see and results to an employee engagement survey where your net promoter score is very low, such as Alex was referring to, that's a clue. If you see that there are consistently more than one person doesn't feel comfortable with their management, so for example, the manager scores in the survey are low, that's a clue. Do something about it. And that's unfortunately not what a lot of companies are doing. They're not following up on those surveys and trying to correct those gaps and make it better. They just let them continue on in their role. And so when we talk about workplace safety and that psychological component, I think that also is revealed in many ways in these surveys as well, because there's always questions in these surveys about how do you feel about management? How do you feel about the company's culture? How do you feel about, and that also comes out. So it's amazing to me that so many companies have this information and don't act on it to their advantage, because it's literally in black and white and there are solutions. And companies like Gallup, who have the engagement survey, also have people who can come in and consult to help take action on those solutions. And I'm sure Dr. John can provide more context around that, but they have answers, they can help.
One of the things that I've seen at places that I've worked, though, that a lot of times employees were afraid to be frank in the employee engagement scores because they doubted the anonymity of the survey. And I can tell you from one place that I worked that there was a little bit of bribery that went on around completing the survey. I had a manager who would say that, okay, if we get 100% participation in the survey, everybody gets a day off. And kind of felt like that had a corruptive impact on the results. And I don't know if this is true at her level, but I got the sense that maybe that was going to weigh in on her performance review, what her percentage was in participation. And I think that that does have a corrupting effect on the survey, because employees sometimes know that, oh, I'm getting a signal that this is how I should fill the survey out.
I agree. In my previous life in one of the organizations, my predecessor in the general manager role before I became Doogie Howser, he actually did attach $50 gift vouchers to the survey PIN numbers that went out to encourage participation, with a incentive of an additional $50 per person if the Gallup engagement score was above a certain level, which, needless to say, integrity is my number one value, and that did not sit well with me whatsoever, and was ultimately one of the final nails in his coffin and his demise from the business. It was just appalling behavior.
I think Dr. John probably can speak to that as well.
There's a lot there, first of all, because I have been with organizations who do these internal engagement surveys. I've never seen it done well with an internal engagement survey for two reasons, I think. The first reason is all the reasons you mentioned. There is this kind of gamesmanship going on about who can get in and the norms we create, like, because gaming is about creating norms, right? And so the norm of don't say what you really think because it may come back to haunt you. And I remember having conversations with colleagues and them saying, I'm not going to put my name on this, or I'm not going to say what I really think because it's going to come back to me. So there's a lot of internal issues, which is why I think it's really important if an organization really wants to do this and send the signal that this is important to the organization. That's what an organization like Gallup can do as a third party. As a third party, you come in, you really don't have any stake in it. And when I've seen this done right, is the third party comes in, does the survey, and they control the dialogue, the content. There's none of this gamesmanship of here's your link and here's a $50 gift certificate. Thanks for filling out the survey. But the other thing that it's called the Q12, and it has 12 basic questions. And it's a question I like to ask people that report to me is, well, number one is, how are you doing? Just how are you doing? Like start there. And that basic psychological need I have to feel safe, just as a human being. Go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the base need. Do you have that in your work? And the last couple of years, some folks have been really struggling with that. When I've seen that in my own organization and other organizations, that struggle is real. But then you have to ask questions like, do you have a best friend at work? And you'd be surprised, and Gallup has some great data on this, the number of people who say, I do not have a best friend at work. And that, think about it, is just detrimental when you walk in every day, either virtually or in person, and you don't have somebody who's going to be expecting you to say good morning, right? If you have a good friend and you see them, you say good morning or good afternoon or how you doing? You ask a question, and innately that brings them in. The other question that I love to ask, and straight out of the Gallup survey, is there someone who encourages my development? That could be a friend, that could be your boss, but is there somebody there who's got your back? And that's a psychological advantage to have someone who's in your corner, whether it's your manager, whether it's a colleague, whatever that is. But those three things are just the basic essence before you get to anything like production and all those other things we were just talking about, which are great things to look at. But if you got to get those basic needs out of the way as an organization, now if you've got those, great, you've got them solidly affirmed in the organization, then you can move on to that kind of next level, if you will. But you'll never get there. I always say strengths never show up without well-being. So if your employees don't have emotional well-being and psychological well-being, their talents and strengths will never show up.
Right. If it's not safe, people aren't going to come out of their shell. One thing that I saw work really well at one organization that I worked at, the employee engagement scores came back and there were some areas of weakness. And the leader of the department invited people to volunteer to be on an advisory council. So it was sort of like an ombudsman group in a way. So it was maybe like 4 or 5 people in a group of maybe 40 who raised their hands. They were not direct reports to the leader. And they were the people that the rank and file employees could go to with issues. And then they met with the manager periodically to share concerns, so that there was a layer of protection, so that if people were raising an issue, that this council could take it to the leader and it could be addressed. Because prior to that, she was really puzzled about like, well, how do I address this? Nobody's stepping up to give me more insight into what's really going on here. And so that helped to create a safer environment where people felt like, oh, I can go to a peer and share with them with the assurance that this isn't going to make it back to the leader about like who did this or who said this. Go ahead, John.
I was going to make one more point on this topic about teams, because when I'm coaching, I'm always saying individuals are not well-rounded, right? We are who we are. We identify those talent themes and we just work the heck out of those and be our best person every day. And that's okay that we're not well-rounded. Teams should be well-rounded, but teams are always going to have weaknesses, right? It's the job of the manager and the team members to collectively come together, identify those weaknesses, and figure out how we're going to mitigate them going forward. I was coaching a team once, and they were really strong at building relationships, but their job was to influence. Their job was to get people to think about community service. That's an influencing idea that you have to have. You're getting someone to change their behavior. And they said, oh, we don't know. We can't do our jobs. We're not good at it. That's why all the metrics were down, all those things. And I said, no, you influence by your relationships. So get out there, leverage every relationship you have to get the message out, to make sure people know the value of community service. And you may have to do that one by one, relationship by relationship, but that's what's going to work for you. And they were able to influence others based on those relationships. So it's really important the team has that ability to say, these are our weaknesses, and create those internal controls, Terry, like you were saying, to mitigate and manage those going forward.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to point out is that everybody who's on this call is in some way a consultant, a coach involved in leadership and development, and the importance of creating that environment in which growth can happen, in which people can feel safe to step up. And one of the things I see quite often in my practice is that people who are bosses or managers, sometimes they get so caught up in just the day to day that they're actually not managing. And I think that it's very important for organizations to realize that they've got a lot of very valuable resources within the organization, but sometimes they do need that catalyst, or they need something to help tap into the full potential of the organization, help those managers rise to the level of leaders so that they are paying attention, so that they are really managing the resources that have been entrusted to them, rather than just kind of coming in and going through the motions and maybe not recognizing that something different needs to be done in order to create additional value for the organization. I'd love to get the thoughts and insights from the panel on that whole idea.
I absolutely agree. I think a manager trusting their people is another key element that great leaders have. They have to trust their people enough to let go of some of the tasks and duties that their department is responsible for. And so that definitely can take some discipline, but that is another thing that seems to hold back toxic leaders, is they have this, one, they don't trust other people, but two, they have this need to control everything. And so those are your micromanagers that come in and try to dictate everything, and people can't flourish in that kind of environment. So the opposite of that is, if you trust your people, they're adults, they're here for a reason. Clearly they have some skill or they wouldn't be there. Find out what that skill or strength is and utilize it, and then step back and trust them to do the job. They may do it better than you. And so that's a good thing. And I think that's also key with the type of leadership we're talking about, is being able to let go and trust others to utilize their strengths for the benefit of everyone.
That's a really good point, but I would say that it's easier said than done. Last time that we talked, Lisa, Kalyani Pardaschi said that the reason why narcissists are narcissistic is because that is the only way that they know how to get their needs met. And so if somebody just has some narcissistic tendencies, so that they're like, hey, I'm the star of the show and I'm going to make this happen, how do we help them bridge the gap from coming in and them feeling like they've got to be at the center of everything and be involved in everything, be that micromanager, to developing the confidence and the skills to trust that if they delegate, that they're actually going to have a more valuable impact? And so how important is it for organizations to be very proactive?
Yeah, from my experience, it's about demonstrating with results. So one of the things, and it's basically the premise of my entire book, I've got a philosophy which is, obviously we learn from our own mistakes, but we can learn from others too. And so the leader I became was through learning from other people's mistakes. And by creating these high-performing cultures within organizations, despite the toxic management of the CEO, for example, by swimming against that tide and demonstrating what success looks like. Because sometimes they just don't know. And sometimes they just think, well, I have always had to bang my fist on the table to get things done and to micromanage, and seeing that there is another way. And now in my career, I've managed to positively influence a few, and by leading upwards. Others, no, they were just basically, they went the way of dinosaurs and became extinct because they just weren't getting it. And I guess for me, when I'm leading businesses and divisions and what have you, the most important thing for me is empowering my team and giving them, I guess, the license to actually sometimes intervene and lead when I'm there. Because there's some aspects of the work that needs to be done where they're more of an expert than what I am. And so it's important to not have this big ego and to be able to step back and let these people lead and get and exercise their empowerment. And with that in mind, in terms of the soft skill, one of the things that I'm really passionate about in leaders is obviously, for me, empathy at the core. And that's one of the most important attributes of a good leader from my perspective. And also the art of influence, and not manipulative influence, which, because sometimes people see it as a negative, it's more the positive influence. And when I'm mentoring and coaching up and coming leaders who are not there yet, they haven't got the role, because I do believe in equipping people with the skill set beforehand, is I always say to them, one of the most important things you can do is demonstrate and develop the skill of influence without the authority. And if you can get people to do things the way you need them done by influencing positively without the stripes on your shoulder, then realistically, that's going to be a positive attribute for you later on. And seeing those types of things happen with the narcissistic leaders alongside, and they see that transition and the results you can generate, sometimes, not always, but sometimes they do have their aha moments.
Yeah, that's so great. Alex, you were talking earlier about being an Australian and going to school in Scotland. And when I was a kid, my dad had a job where we moved around a lot. And so I went to a different school every year when I was growing up. And when you're put into new situations constantly, I think that it causes you to have to be agile, to try different things. And I feel like that served me very well as a human being, but also as a leader, to recognize that there's not sort of this fixed mindset about what is, but that you realize when you travel around and you're in different environments, you start to recognize that there's a whole sort of spectrum of ways to perceive situations. And how important is that? And John and Lisa, I'm sure you guys have a point of view on this. How important is it to have sort of that growth mindset or that agile mindset when it comes to leadership and being willing to try different things and to be successful in leading teams?
I love that question. I think that was one of the things that I learned from my team over the last 15, 20 years is the diversity that they brought to the table wasn't something that I would have known to seek out someone who used to be a musical therapy teacher, but just the diversity of thought that they bring to the table is, I mean, it's just amazing. Like I said, the innovation that comes out of that. And so for my team, we were all virtual for the 10 years that I led them. And I had folks from East Coast to West Coast all across the country. And so the diversity of thought that went into our working together only catapulted us to a higher plane than we would have if I had just hired people that were just like me or that type of thing. And so I think part of the benefit of the whole great resignation / pandemic is the forced remote work component to the job force nowadays. And so that whole aspect was forced on the globe out of necessity. People like myself have been working remotely for decades, but this was new to so many positions. Even teachers were working remotely for the first time. And so that has contributed to the Great Resignation because it also opens up companies now thinking, oh, wait, we can work remotely, which means I can open up my candidate base to the globe. Anybody can work for my company now. You don't just have to be a local who drives in every day. So that alone is going to help bring diversity of thought simply because it adds more people to the equation. But I think that's also partly why the contributor to the Great Resignation, because people do have more choices now. So they're not tolerating these toxic leaders and they're able to leave. They know that they don't have to find a job that's close to home anymore. They can work for some company across the other side of the planet if they want to. And like I said, get to the root of that for the Great Resignation. To John's point earlier, that's the leaders. So fix the leaders and you'll help fix that problem. But the opposite side of that is it also opens up a world of opportunity for you to hire more diverse people on your team.
Yeah, I agree. I think from my perspective too, to the point around having a growth mindset as a leader and being adaptive, and to Lisa's point as well, in my current role of leadership consultant, and my approach to doing that is I actually immerse myself in the business. I'm not your typical consultant who comes in and consults and then gives some ideas and then goes down the street to the next organization. I tend to immerse myself in the business and take on the role of leading the business. So I'm currently leading two businesses that are 2,000 kilometers away. So I'm doing it completely virtually, and they're both very different businesses. One's a law firm and one's a funds management business. And so I'm undertaking COO roles of both of those, and being able to adapt to the very different dynamics and what makes those people tick, what are their needs and wants, what is going to trigger a great resignation in those folk because they are requiring different things to be fulfilled than the next person. So absolutely, as a leader, we have to be continually learning, and we have to be continually not just learning about ourselves and enhancing our skills, we need to be learning about our team. And for me, one of the most powerful things in that space, which I know when I first did it many, many years ago, people thought I was a bit of a kook, was changing the dialogue and the narrative about how we speak about our team. And that means I have banned the word, in a nice way, subordinate. There are no subordinates, there are no superiors. There's a leader and there's a team. And we are all part of the same team. We've just got different roles to play. And that in itself is a mindset shift, not only for the individuals in the team, but also for the leader. Because I think when a leader, and often it's the boss, in quotation marks, who's doing this, when they refer to their team as their subordinates, it's not just a word, it's a behavior. So they are considering their team to be subordinate to them, and then that manifests in their behavior. And one of the questions from John in terms of the Gallup survey, another one that I like, and I won't get this word perfect because I haven't got it here with me, but my manager or someone else at work cares about me as a person. That's one of the most pivotal questions for me in terms of the survey. And I saw a great enhancement in that when I eradicated the word subordinate and the word staff as well from the vocabulary in the business that I was working with, because of the behavioral shift. People referring to their team as their team, and they're rolling the sleeves up and getting stuck in as a member of the team, not sitting up here when the team are down below. So again, that's about having an adaptive mindset and making sure that you are embracing the unique needs of everybody in your team and not seeing yourself as more senior than them.
I love that. I think that relates back to something that you were saying earlier, that when you were in your Doogie Howser role and you weren't speaking up because you kind of felt like, oh, is this my place? And certainly I've been in that place where I had an idea in the meeting and I didn't share it because I did feel subordinate to the other people in the room. And as a coach nowadays, I tell my clients, if you see something, say something, because we are all members of the team and it is our responsibility to lead this business. Even if you're the most junior person in the organization, you have a role. Everybody's role is to create value for the organization. When organizations can impart that everyone is valuable, everybody has a role, even if you're the elevator operator, if companies even still have that, you're providing value to the organization or else you wouldn't be here.
Exactly. I mean, and that job would have its ups and downs, obviously, but I had to go there. I'm starting to feel better. But one of the most telling examples of that, which was something, again, I'll go back to the role where I'd been promoted internally to MD, and I'd been in the role for about 3 or 4 weeks. And I would repeatedly each night, I would just pull up a desk alongside and have a chat with the cleaner that came in on the floor that I was working on. And I got to know this guy really well. And his name was Robert. And one day, one of my executives came up to me and said, Alex, what are you doing talking to the cleaner every night? Why do you do that? I go, well, what, he's not a person? And they said, well, yeah, but you're the MD now. You don't do that. I go, no, this MD does, because everyone has a role to play in this business. And arguably, his role is as important as mine because he keeps the office clean for you to come in every day and enjoy. And that if I hadn't been speaking to him repeatedly, I would not know that he grew up in a remote village in Scotland, 3 miles from where I lived. They're the sort of things you learn from speaking to people.
Wow, that's cool.
So yeah, again, everyone's role is as important as the next. There's different roles to fulfill. That's all.
I think it's really important to think about this dichotomy of fixed mindset versus growth mindset, because I see this a lot when I'm starting the early coaching conversations with a manager, which is something like the fixed mindset of, well, this person has this talent, so that's why they're that way. I'm like, okay, that's a labeling process. You're this, so therefore you've got to act that way. And I really try to pitch them more towards a growth mindset where it's the development aspect of that. So maybe that label is a negative label. What would it look like if it came out with positive intent? I think the growth mindset, go back to this idea of narrative. I think we've talked about this a little bit, this idea of what's the narrative as a leader, and everyone can kind of create that narrative for them. And I encourage folks I coach, what is your leadership narrative? What's your story you tell yourself and others. So one of the things that I like to do is, if I'm in that situation, I talk about how I grew up. I grew up in the middle of Kansas, very, very different place than a lot of people grew up. It was not very multicultural, but I had a mother whose family was from Mexico and a father whose family was from Portugal. So my mother would speak Spanish. My father would kind of understand. I always say that there's like English in our house. There was Spanish sometimes in our house, especially if the parents wanted to talk to each other and didn't want the kids to hear. But if it got to like a DEFCON 5 level where like the parents were arguing, we went Portuguese, Spanish at the same time. And so those multiple languages around the house, multiple cultures around the house was my identity. And what it did is it made the impression on me of going into a space that I didn't know a lot about, but I could ask a lot of questions. So when I would go see my father's family in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, I'd want to ask questions about the Portuguese culture, the language. My grandfather was a sailor, all those things that I wanted to find out about. The same when I would travel to Mexico with my mom or go to Mexico and I'd be there or talk with my grandparents or my uncles to get an understanding of that culture. That was my leadership narrative that I created kind of over time to help me explain how I approach leadership, but also how I approach and leading others. I think it's really important, though, that if leaders don't take the time to have that narrative, whatever that story is that they can share, it doesn't get at the values of why they are doing what they're doing. And that's the worst thing I think you can have as a leader is people don't know what you're doing, or people think you're just there for a paycheck. You will not inspire them. You will not make them perspire. You will just get them angry and upset and disconnected.
Yeah, that's so great. I'd like to start wrapping up. And boy, we've talked a lot longer than what I thought this was going to be, and it's great. So, as I'm wrapping up, I'd love to give the floor to each of you to provide your last words of wisdom on this topic today. So, Alex, why don't we start with you?
Yes, I guess for me, it's about one of the sayings that I don't like, which is asking people how they want to be treated in terms of treating people how they would want to be treated, because often the people who you're saying that to are people who don't care and they just don't get it. So it's about, as a leader, be a leader and tap into your empathy and your EQ and understand what makes your team tick, deeply understand, look for the spark in your people and nurture it. And that's where the magic happens.
Great. Thanks, Alex. How about you, John?
I guess my closing thought on this would be going back to something I said at the start, which is individuals don't leave organizations. Individuals leave managers. And if we as a society, and I love Alex's give them a license approach, which is interesting, but if we don't start valuing the role of the leader and the role of the manager in very measurable ways, because we measure what matters and what matters we measure. And if we don't measure how well our leaders lead, then we are going to be caught in this continuous cycle of just turning people outside of the organization, outside of the work, because the leader doesn't have the skills and the necessary training to do the work that they need to do.
Thank you. And how about you, Lisa?
Yeah, I'm nodding violently to what they both are saying. It just seems so obvious and it's like such a simple solution, but apparently it's not, because we're having this conversation and relative to previous conversations we had where there are laws that are trying to be implemented to help alleviate this. But yeah, if there was some way that I could show people what it looks like when it's done correctly, perhaps that would change more minds across the workforce. But I do think it's all directly related to the leaders. It's the leaders in every organization who have the biggest influence on your bottom line. And that's because they are the ones who directly influence the people who create the services or materials that affect your bottom line. So get the leaders right and everything else will fall into place.
I've seen some research that says that only about 58% of the potential of the average team is being tapped. And Lisa, to your point exactly, that the way for us to increase the capacity that we're getting out of teams, we need to teach leaders, or maybe we should say teach bosses to become leaders. And so investing in helping them lead better. And that could be doing the employee engagement score. That could be giving them resources like the Clifton Strengths Finder. It could be bringing coaches in to help them. To me, this is an insurance policy to help tap into the potential that is within leaders, that are within teams, so there is not this giant churn and people being unhappy at work, which unfortunately has a huge ripple effect within our society. So yeah, let's step up and empower leaders to be true leaders and to eradicate the toxic and bullying behavior that is rampant in so many workplaces. So I want to thank you all for being our guest today. It was really wonderful to have you, and I really appreciate the very, very valuable insights that you shared.
Thanks for listening to Winning the Game of Work. If you enjoyed what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to get in touch, go to the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. And now, get out there and start winning the game of work. I'm cheering you on. Tune in next week when we have two more fantastic experts from Harvard Business School and Columbia University talk to us about what can be done to clean up the toxic workplace and eradicate bullying so that we can all win the game of work.